6:14 in the evening, September 1961. A yellow cab driver working out of a garage on 10th Avenue had been splitting his shifts for 3 years between two stands: the taxi ramp on 42nd Street outside Grand Central Terminal, and the curb on 7th Avenue outside the old Pennsylvania Station, a mile to the south. He was fourth in line at the Grand Central ramp when he checked the arrivals board through the terminal doors, a habit none of the passengers walking past him ever noticed. The 6:09 out of Stamford was running 2 minutes late. 2 minutes did not sound like anything. To a stand driver, it was the difference between a full line and an empty one. It meant the wave of commuters who should already have come down the ramp and folded into the 4 cabs ahead of him hadn't arrived yet, which meant his own position in the queue was about to matter more than it usually did. He adjusted his cap, checked his mirror, and waited. He was not reading a dispatcher's radio call. There was no radio call. A Grand Central taxi stand did not run on a dispatch system at all. No company operator telling him where to go. No fare phoned in from an address across the city. It ran on a timetable that belonged to the New York Central Railroad, and 3 years standing in that line had taught him to read that timetable the way he had once learned to read a customer's face. Not because anyone taught him to, but because the connection between the arrivals board and his own earnings had become so direct that he stopped needing to check the board consciously at all. He just knew. What did 3 years of watching a commuter railroad's on-time performance actually give a cab driver standing in a queue with no radio and no dispatcher? And what happened to a driver's earnings on the days the trains ran exactly when they were supposed to? What the trains running on time gave him: predictability, which in a stand system was worth more than any single fare. A train station taxi stand is a strange kind of taxi work because, unlike a street hail or a radio dispatch, the vehicle itself contributes almost nothing to how the fare is won. The car this driver worked in September 1961 was a Checker A9, the taxi chassis version of the Checker sedan, built in Kalamazoo, Michigan, roomy enough for 4 passengers and their luggage, mechanically simple enough that a garage could keep it running through 200,000 miles of city driving without a serious rebuild. It was not yet the uniform taxi yellow that would later define the fleet. New York City would not require every medallion cab to be painted the same shade until 1967, so his A9 wore an independent fleet's black and yellow checkerboard stripe, one livery among several lined up at the same ramp. The system underneath the car was older and simpler than the vehicle itself. Since 1937, every legal cab in the city had operated under a medallion, a license capped at a fixed number by the Haas Act, regulated at the time not by any specialized taxi agency, but by the New York Police Department's Hack Bureau. There was no Taxi and Limousine Commission yet. That would not exist until 1971. What existed at the Grand Central ramp was older still, a physical taxi ramp built into the terminal's own 1913 design, a queue that self-organized by the simple rule of first in line, first fare, and a driver's understanding of a train schedule that no medallion, no Hack Bureau inspector, and no vehicle specification had anything to do with. Before we go further, if this kind of documentation matters to you, consider subscribing. Every video here goes into one specific aspect of American cab culture: the vehicle, the shift, the medallion, and the specific knowledge of the driver who knew their city in a way that no app has replicated. The experienced Grand Central and Penn Station driver knew which door a suburban commuter would walk out of before the train had fully stopped. A kind of timing no navigation app has ever needed to learn. And if you drove a cab in this era, or your family did, leave it in the comments. If you worked the taxi stand at Grand Central, or the old Penn Station, or your father did, what train did you learn to listen for? The next video follows what happened to the off-duty light in neighborhoods no taxi stand was ever built to serve. Back to the cab. What the medallion and the Hack Bureau regulated was this driver's right to be in that line at all. What they had nothing to say about was what he did once he got there. What he did once he got there was calibrate. A regular street hail driver spent a shift reacting, a raised arm on a corner, a fare that could be anywhere, any destination, any hour. A station stand driver spent a shift predicting. By 1961, he could name the pattern of a weekday evening without looking at a printed timetable. The 5:42 out to New Rochelle, carried a wave of Westchester commuters heading home, which meant nothing for him. They were leaving the city, not arriving in it. What mattered to a stand driver was the reverse direction, the trains coming in. The 609 from Stamford brought people into Grand Central who still needed to get somewhere in Manhattan, a client dinner, a hotel check-in, an office on Park Avenue that a Connecticut commuter kept as a second address 3 days a week. The shift taught him which incoming trains produced fares and which produced almost none. A train arriving at 7:40 in the morning brought commuters walking directly to their own offices on foot. No fare in that wave at all, whatever the ramp looked like. A train arriving at 11:15 at night brought a different population entirely. Theater-goers who had come in from the suburbs for an evening and needed a cab back to the station before the last train home, or intercity arrivals off a late connection who needed a hotel and didn't know the city well enough to walk. Years at the ramp had taught him to read an incoming train's likely passenger composition before its doors ever opened, the way a shopkeeper learns which delivery truck is worth walking outside for. What did that specific timetable literacy cost a driver who had to learn it fare by fare, wrong guess by wrong guess, over years at the same stand? And what happened to a driver who worked the ramp without ever developing it? What happened to a driver without it was a slower shift and a shorter night. Not because the ramp gave him fewer fares, but because he took the wrong kind. The stand system rewarded speed at the front of the line, and speed meant reading the passenger correctly before the cab door had fully closed. An experienced driver learned the two silhouettes that defined a Grand Central fare. The commuter walked fast, carried nothing but a briefcase or a folded newspaper, and named a destination in 5 words or fewer. An office address said the same way every day, sometimes without looking up. The out-of-town arrival walked differently, slower, carrying a suitcase instead of a briefcase, eyes moving across the terminal's hall before finding the ramp at all. That passenger usually needed more than an address. He needed to know it was a 15-minute ride, not 40. He needed the driver to name the hotel back to him to confirm he had the right one. The Biltmore, connected to the terminal by its own private passage. The Commodore, next door on 42nd Street. Something further west if he was headed toward the theater district instead. None of this was written anywhere. The Hack Bureau's licensing exam tested a driver's knowledge of the city's major streets and a small set of official landmarks, not the specific difference between how a Connecticut commuter and a Cleveland businessman carried themselves through a terminal doorway. That distinction lived entirely in the accumulated fares of drivers who had worked the same ramp long enough to stop needing to ask. What did the driver who correctly read a passenger before the destination was given actually save? In time? In fares per hour? In the shape of an entire shift? Compared to the driver who waited for the words. What he saved was the return trip. The part of a station stand fare that never showed up in anyone's earnings figures but shaped every driver's night regardless. A fare from Grand Central to a hotel 8 blocks away paid the minimum on the meter and put the driver back in a taxi line within 10 minutes, ready for the next wave. A fare to an address in a different part of Manhattan entirely. A client's apartment far enough uptown that the drive back to either station took real time, paid more on the meter but cost him position in every queue he might otherwise have rejoined before the next train came in. An experienced stand driver learned to weigh those two outcomes against the arrivals board, not against the fare alone. A short hop to the Statler Hilton, across from the old Pennsylvania station, or to one of the hotels clustered around Grand Central's own block, kept a driver inside the rhythm of the timetable. A longer fare pulled him out of it, sometimes worth taking anyway, sometimes not, depending on what train was due next and how far behind schedule the afternoon already was. A cab driver working a train station stand for years came to know his ramp the way a shopkeeper knows a street corner, not from a manual, but from watching what walked past it, at what hour, wanting what, for enough years that the pattern stopped needing conscious attention. The Hack Bureau's exam could test whether a man knew the route to Grand Central. It could not test what he knew about the 15 minutes after he got there. What happened to that specific accumulated calculation? The weighing of a short hotel fare against a longer one, timed against a schedule no radio ever announced, when the driver who held it eventually left the stand for good. Before you can understand why a taxi ramp built in 1913 was still running on the exact same logic in 1961, you need to understand what the post-war decades did to commuter rail itself. Grand Central Terminal's taxi ramp had been part of the building's original design. A ramp system, not a staircase, engineered so arriving and departing passengers could move between concourse and street without ever competing for the same narrow stairwell. It was built for a railroad at its peak, when nearly all traffic in and out of the northern suburbs moved by train because there was, in practical terms, no other way to move it. By the late 1950s, that assumption was already cracking. The post-war highway boom and the automobiles spread into every Westchester and Connecticut driveway meant a shrinking share of the daily commute chose rail at all. Some of the very commuters this stand had been built to serve had simply started driving into the city themselves, parking in a garage instead of stepping off a train and into a cab. Grand Central's ridership numbers moved in a direction that would have alarmed the engineers who designed the original ramp. But the taxi stand itself did not shrink the way the traffic did, because the passengers who kept arriving by rail were disproportionately the ones without their own car in the city. Exactly the population most likely to need a cab once they reached the terminal. The ramp outlived the assumption that had justified building it, and it did so by narrowing into a more concentrated version of its original purpose: fewer trains, fewer commuters overall, but a taxi stand still synchronized precisely to whichever trains kept running, and a driver's knowledge of that schedule mattering more, not less, as the crowd around him thinned into something more predictable and more specific. Grand Central's ramp held its shape through those decades. A mile south, at the other stand this driver worked. The ground itself did not. The Pennsylvania station he drove to on 7th Avenue in the late 1950s was the original, the 1910 building designed by McKim, Mead, and White, its granite colonnade and soaring glass train shed set directly across the street from the Statler Hilton, a hotel that had been feeding the station's taxi curb with fares since before he was born. Then, in October 1963, the Pennsylvania Railroad began demolishing it. For a stand driver, this was not an abstract architectural loss. It was a 5-year disruption to the single most basic fact his job depended on: knowing exactly where the curb was. Demolition proceeded above a giant steel deck built over the tracks, which meant trains kept running and passengers kept arriving throughout the entire process, but the taxi curb he had learned by feel, its distance from the terminal doors, its relationship to the hotel across the street, the specific angle a cab needed to pull into to load quickly, was being dismantled and rebuilt in stages around him while he still worked it. By 1968, the new Pennsylvania station was complete. An underground concourse beneath the newly built Madison Square Garden and 2 Penn Plaza, its street-level taxi access reduced to a fraction of the old colonnade's footprint. The grand approach he had once described to out-of-town passengers, "Walk toward the columns, the cabs are right there," no longer existed. He had to teach himself a new curb, a new flow of foot traffic emerging from a different kind of doorway, essentially from scratch, in the middle of a career that had already taught him one geography completely. What did it mean for a stand driver's accumulated knowledge, the specific, hard-won read of a single curb, when the city rebuilt the ground it stood on out from under him? And what did he have to relearn that no one who worked Grand Central, a mile north, ever had to? What he had to relearn at Penn Station, he never fully had to relearn at Grand Central. But both stands shared the same vulnerability to something no schedule could predict: weather. A hard rain over Midtown did more damage to a station taxi stand's rhythm than almost anything else, because it converted every passenger who might otherwise have walked to a nearby hotel or office into someone standing in his line instead, at the exact moment when traffic across the neighborhood slowed enough to stretch every fare's round-trip time. A wave of arriving commuters that would clear a ramp in 10 minutes on a dry evening could back up for 40 in a downpour, with cabs returning from their drop-offs late enough to miss the next train's crowd entirely. The regulatory picture changed under him at the same time the physical one did. In 1967, the city ordered every medallion cab painted the same taxi yellow, ending the mix of independent fleet liveries he had started his career among. A a change aimed partly at helping passengers and enforcement alike tell a licensed cab from an unlicensed one working the same curb. That same year, bullet-resistant partitions began appearing behind the front seat, a response to rising violence against drivers across the city through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. In 1971, the hack bureau that had licensed him since the late 1950s was replaced entirely by a new city agency, the Taxi and Limousine Commission, a change in the paperwork behind his medallion that had no effect at all on what he actually knew about a rain-soaked evening at Grand Central, or a delayed train, or which hotel to name first. What did it mean that the formal system regulating his cab kept changing shape around him? New paint, new partition, new agency, while the specific knowledge that made him good at his stand never appeared on a single one of the hack bureaus or the TLC's forms. What eventually did change the value of that knowledge was not a new regulation, but a new alternative. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the subway and bus connections serving both terminals steadily improved, and the specific trip that had defined a station stand fare for decades, the short hop from a train platform to a midtown hotel a few blocks away, began disappearing to travelers willing to walk to a nearby subway entrance instead. It did not happen suddenly. It happened the way most of the changes in this driver's career had happened, gradually, fare by fare, until a driver working the same ramp in the mid-1980s noticed the crowd thinning in a way that had nothing to do with train delays at all. The economics underneath him were shifting too. A medallion that had cost roughly $5,000 around 1950 was worth close to $30,000 by the time the TLC took over regulation in 1971, and it kept climbing through the decade that followed. A change that mattered enormously to the men who owned medallions, and increasingly little to a driver who had always leased his. In 1979, the city changed the leasing rules to let medallion owners rent out a cab by the shift rather than employ a driver outright, converting men like him from something closer to an employee into an independent contractor overnight, responsible for his own bad weeks in a way the earlier system had partly protected him from. Neither change touched what he actually knew about a delayed train at Grand Central or a rebuilt curb at Penn Station. But both changes, together, quietly reduced how much that knowledge was worth to anyone but him. What 40,000 cab drivers across New York City knew, collectively, about their city, was never written down anywhere in full. Not by the Hack Bureau, not by the TLC, not by any single company's dispatch log, because no dispatch log ever covered a stand system in the first place. It existed only distributed, driver by driver, ramp by ramp, each one holding a piece the others didn't. The Grand Central regular who could read a Stamford train's on-time performance from the arrivals board without looking twice. The Penn Station driver who had relearned an entire curb from scratch in 1968 and never forgot the old one either. This driver's piece of that knowledge was 2 specific ramps and roughly 30 years of trains. He retired from driving in the late 1980s. His hack license number was on file with the TLC. What the records showed: license renewed on schedule, no suspensions on file. What the records didn't show: which incoming trains were worth standing for and which weren't. Which passenger, before the door opened, was a 5-minute fare to a nearby hotel and which was headed somewhere across town entirely. What the old Pennsylvania station's colonnade looked like from a driver's seat, and what replaced it, and what it cost a man to learn a brand new curb in the middle of a career he thought he already understood completely. That went with him. The next driver who took a shift at either stand learned it the way he had learned it, by standing in the line, by watching the arrivals board, by doing it enough times that a delayed train stopped being a mystery and started being information. If this channel is worth subscribing to, that's how you tell us. The experienced Grand Central and Penn Station driver knew which door a suburban commuter would walk out of before the train had fully stopped. A kind of timing no navigation app has ever needed to learn. And if you have a cab story from this era, as a driver, as a regular passenger, as someone whose city this was, write it in the comments. If you worked the taxi stand at Grand Central or the old Penn Station, or your father did, what train did you learn to listen for? Which city? Which decade? Which shift?